All right, welcome back. Today we're discussing an article by probably the most famous living utilitarian, Peter Singer, and he's going to argue for what he calls animal liberation, right? In his article, All Animals Are Equal. So he tries to sort of, and remember, he's writing, uh, this article is now somewhat old, right? So when this was written, animal rights was a even less sort of popular subject. These days, many of us at least know some vegans and so on. At the time, it was um, a less yeah people were less open to the idea of animal rights, and so he tries to soften you up by talking about liberation movements in general and how they've operated throughout history. So particularly in the latter half of the 20th century, right, the 1960s through 80s and 90s, we saw sort of a series of liberation movements. First, the civil rights movement of the 60s, made us aware of and tried to get rid of racial prejudice in the United States and made some great success in that area. Uh, Soon after, there was the gay liberation movement. Then there was second wave feminism in the 70s, uh, which is interesting because it's not a liberation movement for a minority. Women are the majority of the world population, so it was a liberation movement for the majority, right? Um, But at that point in the 70s, right, it kind of seemed like, okay, this is the last movement we have to do, right? Quote unquote, solved racism, or at least made, big progress, right, on gay rights and rights for women seemed like, we're heading into the home stretch of everyone being liberated. But of course, all you need to know is a little bit of history to realize that's probably not true, right? Every generation seems to be sort of blind to the types of prejudice um, that they have until they're sort of forced to confront it. So, you know, people in the 60s, right, didn't necessarily think of them as racist, themselves as racist, even if they supported, things like segregation, right? It takes, when you're locked into a certain mindset, it's hard to even recognize your own prejudices. So we should probably assume that we have certain prejudices that we don't even recognize. But the idea of these movements is they're all roughly the same, which is to expand the realm of equality, point out inequalities that exist that had seemed perfectly natural and somehow unavoidable. Um, so Peter Singer is going to argue that the next step is going to be animal liberation. So he thinks that animals, again, a majority, right, of the population of the world is going to be animals. Um, and we have largely accepted that this is a natural fact, right? That they should be treated unequally. Um, I mean, in the past, I don't know if any of you have read Mary Wollstonecraft. So she was writing in the 1700s, but she was kind of an early feminist author. She wrote a book called A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which argued for equal rights for women. And another author sort of wrote a parody of her book that was called A Vindication of the Rights of Brutes, right? And brutes is another word for animals. So the idea, of this joke or this parody was that the same sorts of premises that Wollstonecraft used to argue for women's rights could also be extended to argue for animal rights. And the assumption was that, you know, animals would be absurd, and therefore Wollstonecraft's arguments for women's rights were absurd, right? That was at least the idea of the parody. Now, there's two ways you can respond to this sort of argument. You could point out important differences between women and non-human animals and say, well, yeah, no, just because women deserve rights doesn't mean that non-human animals deserve rights. And I think that's an argument that could be easily made. You may recall in the last lecture, Mill makes this a similar type of move, right, in trying to defend utilitarianism against the swine objection, right? The swine objection says, look, if pleasure is your measure of moral goodness, then like humans are no moral than pigs or something like that. And Mill says, no, 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 there are important differences, right? That's one way you could respond. But another way to respond is just bite the bullet and say, yes, right? Women deserve rights and animals deserve rights. And this is what the option Singer is going to do, right? He's going to quote, bite the bullet. All the arguments, at least that the utilitarian would make to say that, equal rights should extend to this or that group will also extend to animals. So, the premises. What sort of premises would we use to argue for equality among humans, and why might we think that they could extend then to animals as well? So, the basis for these liberation movements tends to be something about the equality of all humans, right? Um, but to really understand those arguments and how they operate, we need to dig into what is meant by equality in this particular context. So, it's in one sense, it's obviously false that all humans are equal, right? There are many humans that are taller than I am. There are many humans that are smarter than I am. There are many humans that are nicer people than I am, right? Humans vary among lots of different dimensions. It's just not the case that all humans are equal in all respects. So, what we mean when we say all humans are equal and use that to argue for, women's liberation, right, or equality, hopefully we shouldn't be arguing from an obviously empirically false premise. Everyone is literally equal in everything. So that can't be what we mean. Another way that all humans are equal would be to say, well, look, obviously individuals differ, right? But as a group, sort of on average, um, women are going to be equal to men in every important way, right? All black people are going to be equal to all white people in every relevant way. Now, this is a more attractive way to understand it. And, you know, so long as it turns out to be empirically true, right, that could be a good argument, right? If it turns out that, women on average are just as smart as men, right? It seems like that is true, right? And in that case, that's a good reason to argue for equality, right? Same thing for people of different races, gay people or straight people. They all seem to be equally smart on average, even though there's individual differences, on average, just as kind to people or as strong or whatever, right? The problem with that argument is it's still an empirical claim, and what if it turned out to be false, right? If you take the averages for everyone, and what if it turned out that, for example, uh, one group's IQ on average was lower than another group, right? I'm not saying that's the case, but you don't want your argument for equality to depend on, right? You don't want to be hostage to like empirical fortune, right? Because it's not like you want to turn around and say, okay, well, then I guess racism is okay if, this one racial group from this other racial group in terms of IQ or whatever other, strength, I don't know, whatever other metrics you're thinking of, right? You don't want it to you want your argument to stand whether or not, however the facts turn out, right? If you give everybody IQ tests or measure their height or whatever you care about. Um, so, although that's a more attractive meaning to say, oh yeah, all groups of humans are equal in all respects on average, still worrisome because it could turn out in a way that you don't really want, right? Um, so, could there be another way of understanding what we mean by all humans are equal? And Singer says, yeah. He says he thinks what people mean, right, when they use this notion of all humans are equal to argue against, you know, again, racism and sexism and things like that, is as a prescriptive claim, normative claim, not a descriptive claim. What we're saying is that all people should be treated equally, right? All people ought to be treated equally, right? We're not claiming some empirical fact about actual equality among people, right? Maybe that's true, maybe it's not, but that's not the point. The point is how we ought to be treating people, right? And that claim is not going to be, it's not a descriptive claim, it's not a empirical claim, so it's not going to be hostage to, how the numbers turn out. And, at the very least, Jeremy Bentham, who's a famous utilitarian, has said things to this effect, right? Each to count for one and none more than for one, right? Remember, Everyone's interest should be considered equally. Everyone's pain counts equally. Everyone's pleasure counts equally. This is a basic tenet of utilitarianism, right? Um, so that seems to be a point in favor of utilitarianism, right? It seems like, yeah, it's the sort of thing that you could use to argue for equal rights, right? Everybody's what really matters is pain and pleasure, and everybody's pain and pleasure counts equally. And we've discussed this idea before, right? The idea is if we presume everyone to be equal, right, or deserving of equal treatment, unless there's a good reason, right? And treating someone unequally without a good reason is unjust. Right? So this works out as an argument against racism and sexism because race, gender, sexuality are just not good reasons to treat people differently. Right? Again, I think I've made this point before. So obviously, you can't let everyone on, like, say, the football team, right? Not everybody makes the team, or the speech team, right? Or the not everyone can be president, right? Um, so in that sense, we're not treating everybody equally, right? So, only a few people get to be president. How come I don't get to be president, right? Is that unfair? Well, no, there's a good reason for these. There's a good reason not to let me on the football team. I'm not very good at it, right? I'm too old. I'll get injured, right? Um, so sometimes there's good reasons to treat people differently. Um, but it doesn't seem like there ever are good reasons, or rarely are good reasons to treat people differently on the basis of race or sex or sexuality, right? Race is not a good reason not to let someone be president, right? Race is not a good reason not to let someone on the football team. Gender is not a good reason not to give someone a job, right? And so on. So that's the idea. That's why racism or sexism wrong. They're just not good reasons for unequal treatment. You know, other things are good reasons. Criminality, right, is probably a good reason to treat someone differently, right? So if someone goes around killing people, then we treat them differently by locking them up, right? That seems perfectly reasonable. Right? Don't lock people up just for being gay. Okay. This premise might also entail the differences in intelligence are not a good reason to treat people differently. Now, in some contexts, it might be, right? So, for example, not everyone gets into every college, right? We we treat people unequally on the basis of, to some degree, intelligence there. But for other people, intelligence maybe doesn't matter, right? So, we don't deny people the right to vote just on the basis of, lower than average intelligence and so on, right? So, that's interesting because that's one important difference between humans and animals, right? Their intelligence. Um, some animals are, quite intelligent. They're not as intelligent as any of you, right? Um, but that doesn't mean that they don't deserve any rights, right? Just like humans who are less intelligent than us deserve some rights, right? So maybe a pig doesn't deserve to be president or to attend this college, right? But a lack of intelligence doesn't mean that necessarily that you're allowed to torture and eat someone, right? Or an animal. Jeremy Bentham, you know, uh, sort of saw this a long time ago, right? Again, remember he was um, John Stuart Mill's teacher, right? So Jeremy Bentham, we're talking about 1800s here. Um, he says when we're talking about the principle of equality, right? What matters is not, again, how we should treat people and whether people should be treated equally. He says the question is not can they reason or can they talk, but can they suffer? Again, the utilitarian pain and pleasure are the values, right? So we're thinking about how should we treat people. It's going to boil down to beings that are worthy of our moral consideration are going to be the kinds of beings that can feel pleasure or pain, right? That is always the moral question for utilitarian, right? The capacity for pain and pleasure, because this is the ultimate value according to the utilitarian, for which we have all our other interests, right? My interest in, your interest in going to school, getting a good grade, and getting a job, and having a house and eating food according to utilitarian, is all about avoiding the pain of hunger and homelessness, right? And attaining the pleasures you can get with money. Um, so the reason you have any interest at all is because you have the capacity to feel pleasure. But here's a quote again from Bentham. stone does not have interests because a stone does not suffer. I'm not sure if that quote's from Bentham or if it's Singer quoting Bentham. At any rate, it's a good quote. So, for the utilitarian, capacity for pleasure or suffering is the only boundary we can draw around equal treatment. Stones don't deserve equal treatment because they cannot suffer. But if a rabbit can suffer, then it does deserve, in some areas, equal treatment, right? Again, it doesn't deserve necessarily to be let into the college as a student, but torture it arbitrarily. So, if racism is discounting someone's interests on the basis of race, because race is an inadequate reason for unequal treatment, we think that racism is wrong. Then, according to Singer, since species is an inadequate reason for unequal treatment, right? Then discounting an animal's interests on the basis of species is speciesism, right? Um, one example of speciesism, it's hard to say, would be eating meat, right? So when we kill and eat an animal, we're treating their lives as a means to our pleasure, right? Again, yes, we do need to eat to survive, but you don't have to eat animals to survive, right? You can have a vegetarian or vegan diet, adequate nutrition, right? So when you eat a steak, according to Singer, um, the only difference between the steak and the eggplant you could have had is a certain amount of pleasure you get out of the steak, right? Amount of pleasure, so that animal's life is worth a little extra pleasure over the eggplant, right? According to Singer, and he says that shouldn't be the case, right? This is what I just said, right? And I'll leave it up to you to look up factory farming. So it's not just the killing of the animals, right? But in our current system, their entire lives, for the most part, leading up to the killing, are largely torture as well, right? So again, if suffering is the most important, right, value, the most relevant criterion of moral significance, if animals can suffer, then we're not justified in discounting their interests in living and not suffering merely because they're of a different species. Irrelevant as race. Here, what's relevant is can they feel pleasure and pain. There's like a nice, delicious Ethiopian meal. If you've never tried Ethiopian food, it's vegetarian. Well, they have meat and vegetarian versions, but when eating Ethiopian, I prefer the vegetarian versions. So, I mean, for example, here's something we do to animals, right? So, medical experimentation is another case of speciesism. Um, my degree is in philosophy and cognitive science, right? And so I have some knowledge of what we do to animals when we're studying the brain. And what we do is we open up their heads, hole in their skull. We stick an electrode. You can stick an electrode into like a single neuron, and then you can tell if that neuron is firing or not, right? And they do it to cats too. And we learned a lot about sort of the neural structure of the brain, particularly of the visual centers. Um, it's not pleasant, right, for the monkeys and the cats. We don't do it much anymore, right? Vivisection is another thing we do, right? So we will um, we will cut open animals while they're alive for various medical reasons to study various things. And Singer says, look, if you wouldn't be prepared to do that to a human baby, you shouldn't do moral difference. Because an adult cat or monkey is at least as capable of suffering and having interest as a human infant, right? Now, um, an adult cat may not have an interest in college and getting a job, right? But they do have things they want and things they don't like. Right? Anybody who owns pets knows that much, right? They want their dinner, they want to go for a walk, and so on. That's Singer's argument, right? There's no relevant moral difference between humans and animals, right? The only relevant moral difference is pain and pleasure, and they can both feel pain and pleasure, um, right? They should be treated equally in that respect. Um, but someone might respond and say, no, there are important differences. I mean, there are differences. occur between humans and animals as a group, right? Um, Levels of intelligence, right? Ability to speak language and so on, right? So perhaps we could push back on Singer and say, no, pain and pleasure is not the relevant moral divide. There's another one. It's rationality, or it's the ability to speak language, or something like that, right? Well, Singer comes prepared for those sorts of arguments, right? So again, you can come up with a good reason to treat the two groups differently, right? You might say, oh, it's okay to treat animals worse because they're not as smart, right? And maybe you think that not being as smart is a relevant moral difference, right? Um, but Singer says, look, wherever you draw the line, you're either going to leave some humans out or let some animals in. So, for example, right, uh, intelligence the line, right? Are we allowed to treat, beings of IQ greater than, call it whatever, 74 or something, um, you know, well, and treat anyone with IQ below 74 poorly and do experiments on them and eat them? Well, if that's the case, there's going to be some humans, right, that fall below IQ of 74, and so you can perform experiments and eat them, right? And wherever you draw that line, maybe draw the line lower. Um, but the truth is, there are going to be some apes that are smarter than some humans, right? But some humans have severe cognitive disabilities that mean we can eat them, right? So it doesn't mean we can do medical experiments on them. So if intelligence is the line, there's significant overlap between the smartest animals and the most cognitively impaired humans, and you're not going to like results, right? If you draw out the line with intelligence, right? You're going to end up having to say it's okay, which we don't. We try the ability to enter a social contract. We've seen that one, right? So yeah, we can enter into a moral contract with other rational humans and not with animals. That seems like a very relevant moral difference. Problem is, there's babies, right? Um, and you're with a baby any more than you can with a cat, but uh, surely you can't, right? Use the for medical experimentation like you would the cat. And you might sort of draw up a gerrymandered uh, dividing line and say, look, uh, the difference between humans and animals is humans have human dignity. Okay, that's just another way of saying they're humans, right? So that's what we call question making. You're assuming the conclusion in right your premise there. So it has to be. It can't just be something that sort of ad hoc carves out all the humans. Um, and sure, right? We have our instincts tell us that we don't treat animals and humans the same, right? It doesn't feel like it's the exact same to, oh, if there's a starving dog and a starving baby and only so much food, well, it doesn't matter, flip a coin. That that feels very strange to all of us. Of course, we want to privilege the human, right? But Singer wants to challenge us there and say, well, is this a moral intuition that is important and we ought to respect, or is this just prejudice, right? It's hard to tell the difference sometimes between your moral intuitions and just your prejudices. Again, we were doing this course 100 years ago, and I brought up the issue of, interracial marriage. 100 years ago, a lot of people would feel intuitively, oh no, that's immoral, right? So that's obviously a prejudice. So, Singer is asking us, is our current, right, intuitions that it's okay to treat animals worse than humans? Um, he's asking you why, right? Are you really just prejudiced against animals? 100 years, right, we'll think, man, look at those terrible people, right, in 2024 that thought it was, better to save a baby than a dog. So, I don't know if you find this challenging, right? If not, I don't know how many of you are already interested in animal rights, or if any of you are vegans for any of these, moral reasons. Maybe you hadn't thought through whether it was a utilitarian reasons or not, but at any rate, I think it's an interesting argument and one way that utilitarianism is alive and well in contemporary, moral discourse. All right, see you next time.